Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for hopping on. I'm just going to wait a few moments here as folks continue to jump on the webinar, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, we are a few moments past 1, so I'll go ahead and get started. A couple housekeeping items before we jump into the presentation. First, this webinar is getting recorded, so in the event that anyone does it to jump early, I'll be following up after the webinar with the recording, so you'll be able to access the information through that recording. Second, if you wouldn't mind, if any questions pop up throughout the presentation, going ahead and throwing them in the Q&A box, and we will circle back to them at the end of the presentation. And lastly, if there happens to be anyone in the audience today that has survived a storm event in the past, please feel free to add to the Q&A box measures that you might have taken that have worked for you in the past, so that way we can continue this conversation, continue to learn and grow together, and expand our education on disaster preparedness together. My name is Tessa Barron. I am SVP's Preparedness Program Associate. My background is in mitigation, specifically working with stormwater studies, plans, and master plans. And this is all at the state level with the South Carolina Office of Resilience. I am really happy to be chatting with you all today about different actions that can be taken at the household level to increase our preparedness, our resilience, and to ultimately keep us safe with this upcoming hurricane season. The purpose and the principles behind this presentation, to do a little bit of foundation laying, are to teach you practices and plans that you can put into place, so that way there's a more calm and a more predictable approach to resolving the problems that flow from disasters. If there's a plan in place, and if those measures that we talked through today, if those are implemented, then the impact will be less severe on you and those that you care about. Bear with me for 1 second, please. My apologies, we're facing some technical difficulties getting the slideshow to progress here. Okay, wonderful. All righty. Thank you for your patience there. SVP's main mission is to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. And the organization does so by using a really comprehensive approach that incorporates the 5 aspects of disaster recovery, long-term recovery, and community resilience that you see listed on the slide here. So that's build, share, prepare, advise, and advocate. And with an approach that encompasses these 5 areas, these are our departments, our programs, we also call them our interventions. By using all 5 of these in one approach, we're able to tackle the entire disaster spectrum. And we'll get into that a little bit further into the presentation. So here's our agenda for today. I will first be starting out with a brief overview of SVP's Prepare program. Then we'll jump into building a culture of preparedness, and we'll talk about what this really means for us. And then lastly, the bulk of our conversation today is going to be about these 5 key preparedness actions that we see listed. So first, knowing our risks, knowing how these risks are evolving, and I'll point to some specific tools and resources that we can use to plug into and to see firsthand what our current risks are and what our future risks are. Then we'll talk about making a preparedness plan, and I'll walk through the different components of that plan. Then we'll go into a conversation about purchasing flood insurance, and I'll provide some good background knowledge there, walking through the difference between homeowners and flood insurance and just some important considerations to keep in mind. Then we'll talk about safeguarding important documents. So this will be pretty brief, but we do have a couple buckets of categories, a handful of checklists that we have for those different categories that are just important to consider as we're inching forward towards hurricane season that you're going to want to make sure are protected. And then lastly, we will talk about mitigating risks to property. And that will be a combination of 1, inspections and maintenance actions, 2, quick actions that you can take pre-storm, like laying sandbags and things of that nature. And then lastly, we'll talk about long-term mitigation options with some budget-friendly mitigation options tucked into that as well. Before we get into it, I do just want to share with you all that we will be both in the link or in the chat at the end of the presentation, including a link to our 5-minute survey. And when I send that follow-up email that will have the webinar recording, we'll have a link to the survey as well. If you wouldn't mind just taking a few moments to check out the survey and add some input, we would really appreciate any feedback. We really do look at these and we read through all of the comments, all of the responses to help evaluate participant learning so we can continue working on these presentations and making sure they're as additive to our audiences as possible. Okay, so to jump into a Prepare program overview. Specifically through the Prepare program, we aim to better equip not only households, but also businesses, local officials, nonprofits, other leaders in the disaster space with the knowledge and capacity to make informed disaster preparedness decisions so we can ultimately build more resilient communities. And when we say resilient communities, we mean communities that are prepared for storms in the face of storms that can absorb the impact and withstand the storm, and then in the aftermath can rebuild and ultimately thrive. So how do we do that? 1, through the preparedness program, we offer a plethora of trainings. So like the one that we are going through today, we offer trainings for homeowners and renters. We also do trainings for small businesses. So with a business continuity and a preparedness for employees type of focus. We also do presentations for nonprofit audiences and local officials, and these can be online, again, like today. We do these in person. We do one-off trainings and series of trainings. And the point that I'm trying to emphasize here is that we work with our partners and we work based on the audience that we're going to have to make sure that these trainings are tailored and are going to be as beneficial as they can possibly be for our audiences. So in addition to those trainings, we also have a wide menu of resources for taking action. So we have some strong e-learnings that I really enjoyed looking through the first time. They're on things like wildfires and tornadoes, et cetera. So I really encourage you to check out those. Those are absolutely wonderful. We also have checklists, resources, online videos, and these are all on our website, which I will link to in that follow-up email. And we even have an Equip app, which houses this information. And at the end of our presentation today, I will include a QR code that will link you to the Equip app if you feel like checking that out once we wrap up. So in addition to the resources that the Prepare program offers, SDP as a whole has a wide variety of resources, and these are really useful, and we urge survivors to check these out because they help survivors navigate the recovery and avoid some common pitfalls that we see, like contractor fraud, mold scams, and complex FEMA and insurance processes, things of that nature. And these can be found on SBP's website as well. Okay, so now we'll shift gears to the second item on our agenda today, and this is building a culture of preparedness. So why is this important to us? Well, unfortunately, we know that there will be a next disaster. It's not a matter of if, but when. So as we make these tough recovery decisions, it's absolutely critical to think about how we can equip ourselves better for the next event. So there are two main takeaway items that I want to emphasize when we're talking about building a culture of preparedness. What we have on this slide here is the National Disaster Recovery Framework. And we have this up here because it's a really strong visual that shows the entire disaster cycle. So the first key takeaway item with building a culture of preparedness is that oftentimes when people think of disaster preparedness, it's this mindset or the series of activities that's siloed to the beginning of the disaster cycle. What we want to urge folks to do is to reframe their thinking of preparedness, and rather than having this be a series of events, of actions, of things to do pre-storm, rather we want to take preparedness and embed that throughout the entire disaster cycle. So from the immediate response all the way to building long-term resilience. Of course, disaster preparedness will engage with it differently throughout the disaster cycle, but it's just this idea of keeping preparedness at the forefront of your mind as we, face these storms, as we go into hurricane season. It's something that needs to be embedded throughout our conversations and our thought processes about storms. Okay, so the second idea here is that we need to consider preparedness at different levels. So today, you all that are in attendance are doing a really great job of starting to get prepared at the individual and the household level. Well, we also want to consider preparedness as an additional layer for our local community, at state government, at the federal government. And that's because we want to think about it like this. There are only so many resources, federal funds that can be allocated to folks after disaster. And since those resources are limited, we do want to make sure that they get to the most vulnerable populations. So for example, that's communities where there might be a high amount of folks that are 65 and older, or that are caring for children that are 5 and under, or maybe a community with a lot of disabled persons. So SBP as a whole, we prioritize serving these communities, those that are high risk, low capacity, and most vulnerable in this face of storm events. So we want to make sure that we are proactive and we are encouraging people to get as prepared as they can possibly be. So that way, these limited government resources can get allocated to those who unfortunately really would not be able to recover if not for those resources. But rest assured, we will throughout the rest of the conversation highlight a plethora of other financial mechanisms for recovery and for preparedness. And as we talk through them, I encourage you to think through what makes the most sense for you and your family. Okay. So now we're going to shift gears to the bulk of our conversation, and that is those 5 key actions that we can take and that we can implement at the household level to increase our preparedness, keep us safe, and increase our individual and our community resilience. And this really starts with knowing our risks. So I want to emphasize here again that SBP's main mission is to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. And when it comes to preparedness, the best way that we can shrink this time between disaster and recovery is by reducing the need for recovery in the first place. So how do we do that? We prepare. And we need to know exactly the level that we need to be prepared. So getting a really strong understanding on our risks is where we're going to start off. So understanding risks is a key part of being prepared. And in order to fully grasp your risks, it's crucial to understand just how these risks are changing. Extreme storm events are becoming more frequent, unfortunately, and places that weren't positioned to be at risk in the past are now increasingly so. One consideration here is that government flood maps are not solely reliable indicators of flood risks. These maps, they're not are consistently assessed and updated for a variety of reasons. And therefore, if you depend on this information, you'll be preparing for an outdated level of risk, which of course is insufficient. Because our risks for flood events are changing, we encourage you to continue educating yourself and keep learning about those risks. So before we shift gears to walking through two great tools that SBP urges folks to use to understand their risks, I just want to draw your attention to this very profound statistic that we have at the bottom of the slide. So this states that 90% of US counties have experienced a natural disaster extreme enough to receive a federal disaster declaration in approximately the past 10 years. That is significant. I remember feeling when I had first read that statistic that really, is a strong statistic to drive home the importance of getting prepared. It can happen wherever you are, as we see again, 90% of US counties. So very important to understand your risks and to prepare properly to the exact extent that you need to. So here's the first of two tools that I'm going to share with you today that are going to help you understand your risks and continue educating yourself. So this first one is called Risk Factor, and it's was developed by the First Street Foundation. And it's a really cool tool that you can, as a family activity, perhaps sit with your family in front of your computer at your home or your local library and plug in either your zip code or your address. And after doing that, you can get an idea. You could see not only your current risks, but your future risks. So really great tool that we encourage folks to use. While your personal experiences with any past flooding events that you might have encountered, that certainly has given you a lot of information about what areas are most vulnerable. It's important to remember that future floods may affect communities in different ways. So that just, again, speaks to the importance of continued education. An interesting tidbit of information that I do like to throw in here as well to drive home the importance of taking on this education yourself is that most states actually do not require home sellers to disclose past flooding information to homes. That is absolutely significant when it comes to the fact that you need to be proactive in continuously, again, educating yourself and knowing your risks, because it's just, folks do not need to share it with you in this scenario when you're going to buy a house. So again, just to highlight that importance. So the second tool that we're going to talk about briefly today is FEMA's National Risk Index for Natural Hazards. And this is a really great tool because while with that first one that I shared in the previous slide, that's going to show you a great picture of your individual risks. This tool is going to show you the risks that your community will face as a whole. As we all know, natural disasters, they certainly don't follow any jurisdictional boundaries. So they're going to hit a community as a whole, and to have the most comprehensive understanding and the most comprehensive preparedness plan, you'll need to know not only what you will face, but what your entire community will face. So having the tools that you need to determine your individual level of risks and your community's level of risks, I mean, that's absolutely paramount to the conversation of disaster preparedness. However, it is only half of the battle. So getting plugged into these information sources like the ones we have here, local news and weather apps, NOAA's weather radio, other emergency weather apps, etc., that's going to enable you to receive information on incoming hazards as they're happening. So that's going to make sure that you have the information not only on your risks and what you're anticipating will happen, but on disaster events as they're coming. You're able to stay in the know. If you need to evacuate, for example, you have received your alert and you are ready to go. So it's going to help you act quickly. And this is the other side of the coin when it comes to risks and staying in the know. That's going to enable you to keep your family safe and, again, potentially evacuate if need be. Okay. So now we're going to go into the second key action that is from the large bulk of our conversation today, and that is making your preparedness plan. I really like this part of the presentation because not only does it cover these very traditional items that we think of when we think of disaster preparedness, which you'll see in the next coming slides, but it also incorporates a recovery plan and making that recovery plan as a part of the overall preparedness plan. We'll dive into that in a moment here. But first, I'd like to start off by telling just a quick story about one of SVP's clients. And this highlights the importance of staying in the know. So this is a story of a past SVP client, Bill, and his wife, Sophia. They live down in Naples, Florida. And they were having a pretty difficult time determining whether or not they wanted to evacuate before Hurricane Ian. Unfortunately, they lost power very quickly and they were not prepared for that. And so because of that, they had lost their access to incoming information. And so they were not able to plug in and get a sense of exactly when the storm would be hitting, the severity of the storm, et cetera. As you can see here on the slide, as Bill notes, you have no idea, no control. And once that communication is down, you really are at the mercy of whatever happens. I do want to take a moment to emphasize here that Bill and his wife are okay. However, they did end up losing their home and their possessions. So we like to, during these presentations, bring in some client stories just to make it more real and to show folks that this does happen. And it is important that we need to make plans in advance, plans pre-disaster on what we're going to do and how we're going to navigate once a disaster hits. Okay. When working with your family to develop your preparedness plan, I highly encourage you to use SVP's resource guide. This will be in that follow-up email in the link to SVP's website. You can find that resource guide directly through there if you so choose to use it. It's a really helpful tool and it can help guide you through different components that we're going to talk through today. We'll spend some time now walking through these key components. And as we do so, I just do encourage you to think through your family's specific needs and how you're going to tailor these steps to be the most beneficial for you and your family. So we have here step 1, putting together your supplies kit. Step 2, creating your emergency plan. And step 3, that recovery plan that I alluded to just a moment or two ago. So here are some key components, some key basics of planning, and some things that you'll need to consider in advance. So those are things like gathering supplies, communication and information, evacuation, and sheltering. Think through the following questions and considerations with your family when developing your plan. And those are things like, how will you communicate in an emergency? So for example, in Bill's case, with him and his wife, Sophia, losing power, they hadn't anticipated that. And unfortunately, they did lose touch with the outside world. And so that's something that we need to consider prior to a storm. What will happen if we can't use our cell phones, or if we run out of charge pretty fast and don't have the ability to plug back in there? So this might look like ensuring that a portable battery is charged at all times and ready for use. That could be a temporary solution there. Or it'd be something like carrying an emergency contact card or arranging an out-of-town contact to coordinate through in advance of a storm. You'll want to consider how you plan to evacuate the house if need be. And especially, the importance here is practicing this plan. It's one thing to make the plan, but another to practice it, especially if you have perhaps small children or some pets that you need to account for. You'll want to decide on a neighborhood or an out-of-town meeting place in advance if you need to leave the area, and maybe even map out those evacuations and where you'll go in advance, just to have a strong idea on that part of the plan. You'll want to consider the safest room in the house to shelter in the event that we're dealing with something like a tornado or another high wind event, and planning for any special needs in the event of power or water loss or evacuation. And again, just want to highlight here the importance of practicing your plan with your household and also keeping it up to date. Again, just want to share with you all that SVP does have checklists and guides. There's more information on all of these areas, but I will highlight a few things further into our discussion today. So you'll want to plan for your needs if you have to shelter at home. We have a really strong list here that will start you off on items that would be really pretty useful to have in your supplies kit. So 1 to 2 weeks worth of supplies, that's typically what we recommend. It's a good starting point. If you have to evacuate, pulling together a to-go bag in advance with the minimum of 3 days worth of supplies is good there. So again, 1 to 2 weeks if you are sheltering in place, but about 3 days worth of supplies if you have to hit the road and evacuate for a period of time. And when pulling together this specific list and with sitting with your family and running over what we have here and making additional items, you'll want to think about specific items that you need for potentially your kids or your pets, or if there are elderly folks in your family that happen to live with you. And also something that I always like to throw in here is that while of course we need our necessities, we need food, water, medications, etc., everything on this list, it's good to also think about maybe some comfort items that may be wanted in times of distress. The important step now is to have this kit prepared now, because unfortunately, you never know when a disaster can strike. So step 2, staying ready. Know the emergency plans, for example, your employer, for schools, if maybe you or your children are in school, and perhaps any other organizations that you're involved in, like a church or a volunteer group. Monitor your TV, radio, and apps to stay updated on the latest conditions in the event of severe weather. And stay in touch with family, with neighbors. Plan to check on any neighbors who may need assistance preparing for or evacuating in an emergency. Definitely encourage everyone to follow official directions for sheltering or evacuations. Take those evacuation recommendations seriously, and you could be helping to save lives here. Very important. Okay, so step 3. Making your recovery plan. This is absolutely paramount to the preparedness plan that we're talking about now. And that is because financial preparedness underpins all aspects of recovery. What it boils down to is that you'll need money, to put it bluntly, not only to get back into safe living conditions, but also to better prepare your homes for future floods in advance. Unfortunately, most low-income families struggle to access all 4 recovery funding sources, and these include a lack of savings, limited access to credit, insufficient or delayed disaster aid, and insufficient or no disaster insurance coverage. I encourage you to go through an exercise walking through each of these 4 different sources to determine what is the most realistic and also what you could actually rely on should a disaster occur. Here we have a couple integral questions that you'll want to be asking yourself as you develop the recovery portion of your preparedness plan. When making that recovery plan, think about how you may have to shift your finances and rebudget in some scenarios to ensure that you have a reliable source for a predictable and speedy recovery. You may even want to consider talking to perhaps a financial advisor and walking through this exercise with some guidance there. So we'll now take a little bit of time just to review those 4 funding those 4 mechanisms for financial preparedness and for financial recovery. And the first is setting aside emergency cash. I don't say this lightly here. I know that this, especially in this financial climate with inflation, it's not always realistic. It's not doable, but there certainly is a trade-off. And the trade-off here is, if it's possible to set aside emergency cash for the reasons listed below, which we'll get to in just one moment, that does mean that you will have a more predictable recovery. So In the face of a storm event, it is very, very likely that you might encounter unexpected costs. So say you have to evacuate, and you need to pay the cost for a hotel room, for gas, for additional water or food or other basic necessities. Having emergency cash saved in advance will significantly help you and your family access the things that you'll need to be safe during a storm event. In addition to those things like hotels and basic necessities, you'll want to consider saving for deductibles. So deductibles, that's the amount of money that you'll be responsible for paying out of pocket toward an insured loss. So what this means is that you'll be responsible for paying your deductibles before receiving any sort of insurance claim. So because of that, saving for deductibles really is a critical part of pre-disaster planning. Oftentimes, survivors are surprised by how high their fuel costs are to run generators and to drive longer distances, maybe to reach stores that are open following disaster events. So if your home is made uninhabitable by a disaster, having an emergency fund is important for covering long-term stays away from your home as repairs get made, if that is a situation that you find yourself to be in. With the option of loans and credit, it's important to understand when there's a federal disaster declaration and federal assistance comes into play, you'll be able to access assistance through FEMA, surely, hopefully. But first, before you are directed to FEMA to determine whether or not you are able to receive any sort of financial assistance, you will actually first be directed towards the Small Business Administration. So something that we like to highlight here, I know when I was first learning this process, it can be a little bit confusing. Why am I getting directed to SBA as opposed to FEMA? When I think of disaster recovery, my mind jumps to FEMA. So something that we like to make sure that we emphasize here is that before having any type of interactions with FEMA, SBA is who you will be engaging with first. Credit and loans are one of the things that if you don't have savings, getting a loan or accessing credit can certainly be an option to help pay for some of those unexpected costs up front. So like I just started to mention, disaster aid, likely the first thing that you think of is this disaster aid. So there's a couple of challenges here that we want to walk through. And the first is this potential assumption that you might get more money than you actually will, and that you may or may not actually even qualify for federal disaster aid. The way aid works is that it's only meant to go to a household once. So unless a household takes out insurance coverage, any future occupant will not be able to get access to disaster aid. It's important to understand that disaster assistance is limited and not guaranteed. So this goes back to our earlier conversation about building a culture of preparedness, knowing that these government resources are limited and knowing that they're there certainly to tap into if it makes sense for you and your family and if you qualify, but understanding that there are these other financial mechanisms for preparedness, it's really crucial because again, their assistance is limited and not guaranteed. It's important to understand that not every disaster is going to be big enough to trigger a federal disaster declaration. And even if granted, assistance is often very limited and it can take an extended period of time before they actually become available. So this is why financial preparedness, again, thinking through loans and savings and emergency cash, having the right insurance is so important. With that being said, though, if applying for disaster aid is a viable option for you, we absolutely highly encourage you to apply for aid and also to appeal your award amount to make sure you're awarded as much money as possible. And that's because this is likely your only opportunity to rely on disaster aid unless you do purchase insurance coverage for your property in future, in which case you can qualify again. Important to note here that at SBP, we do have a very robust FEMA appeals program. Survivors who have been a part of this program have seen a 66% increase. So it's at least $8,000 additional dollars towards the recovery effort. So it's really a significant amount. Okay. So at this point, we've covered building a culture of preparedness, knowing risks, and making a preparedness plan, along with the different steps that comprise a preparedness plan. If you recall, I mentioned that there are four main recovery funding sources or mechanisms, and we've covered the first three. Now we're going to take a little bit of time to dive into that last funding source. And that also happens to be our next key action that can be taken in order to be best prepared for this upcoming hurricane season. That's getting the right insurance. Some of you may already have insurance, whether it's homeowners insurance, car insurance, health insurance, etc. And if you do, you may realize that insurance policies they're full of legal language, and oftentimes they really do seem to be written to be intentionally confusing. Do not be afraid of getting the help that you need in order to really understand what's in your policy and the coverage that you're purchasing before you finalize it. I myself am a renter, and so I am aware and I recognize that it is confusing to interpret insurance policies. And that's exactly why I want to take some time here to hone in on this subject next. At SBP, we advocate for everyone to have flood insurance coverage. Insurance is actually cheaper for those outside of the mandatory purchase zones. This ties directly back to our earlier conversation, again, about knowing your risks. As I mentioned, those government flood maps, they're not accurate. So just because you might not need to purchase flood insurance, SDP highly advises that you do because you may still be at risk. I'd like to take a moment here to urge you again to go on riskfactor.com to understand your risks and your current risks, and to really see the importance of purchasing a flood insurance if that's a viable option for you and your family. So before you purchase any flood insurance, it's important to know the basics of what's in your insurance policy. So what we have listed here are some standard parts, and that's what you will have coverage for. So for any renters in the audience like myself, we need to know that our landlord's insurance will only cover the structure of the apartment building or the rental home, and not actually the stuff inside that we own. So we will need, if a renter, of course, again, your own renter's insurance policy. You need to know your policy type. So to walk through this a little bit, named peril policies means that you're covered for losses resulting from the perils that are specifically listed in your policy, but nothing else. All risk policies cover you for any accidental cause of loss, except those specifically excluded in your policy. It's crucial to know if you have replacement cost coverage as well. This will give you enough to replace lost items with those of a similar kind or quality. Actual cash value, and that is the value of your items less depreciation, that won't be enough if you need to replace those items. So all risk policies have exclusions, and exclusions are policy provisions that waive coverage for certain types of risks or events. Unfortunately, many people are unaware that they aren't already covered for flooding by their existing homeowners or renters policy. Many people are also unaware of the importance that they get covered. It's of utmost importance to take time to understand exclusions in your policy. Don't be afraid to ask questions and go back to your agent for more details or for some clarification. Don't be afraid to ask another trusted source and get a second opinion. What matters most here is your understanding and making sure that you're purchasing exactly what you think you're purchasing. That is absolutely a priority. And while it can be time consuming, it won't cost you anything to have these conversations so you can truly understand what is and what isn't in your policy. So this is a really great online tool that we point folks towards. Has been developed by Rutgers University, and you can go on and look at individual pros of policies provided by each company, as well as things to watch for related to property insurance coverage. So what this tool does is it ranks the different companies that offer insurance, along with different factors like how good the coverage is, how well it corresponds with risk and what it pays. And this screenshot that we have here on the slide, it's an overarching chart, but there are also different breakdowns of individual companies on the tool. So definitely encourage you, when you are talking to your families about flood insurance, to check out this tool and just see what's available. So as we talked about, flood insurance is not covered by standard homeowners insurance policies, but it really is our top recommendation at SBP that anyone with any level of flood risk should have homeowners insurance. I encourage you to speak with your agent about the National Flood Insurance Program policies and private flood insurance options that are in your state. Options that both have partial coverage and full coverage, so you can get a really comprehensive understanding of what's available and to perhaps understand what it is that you already have, if you have flood insurance, of course. So there are a few things here on the flood insurance side on understanding why flood insurance is becoming more expensive. So I just want to take a moment to talk about this. A number of factors are considered when determining your annual flood insurance premium. So these are the things that the NFIP and most private flood options replicate, they consider as factors. So this is, things like what the flood zone is, what type of coverage is being purchased, and do you have a high or a low deductible? What is the age of the building, et cetera? All these factors are really important, and they certainly do impact what the rate will be. So the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, it is about a 50-plus-year-old program, and it had grandfathered rates. So where a lot of properties had artificially low rates that did not actually correspond to the current flood risk level. So FEMA went through a very complicated process to make some updates to this rating system, the rating system that NFIP uses. And that's how Risk Rating 2.0 got developed. So it was released, Risk Rating 2.0 was released about a year and a half ago, and it includes a more comprehensive analysis of flood risk for each property. And the idea behind Risk Rating 2.0 is to try to make insurance rates more equitable by getting rid of those rates that were artificially low in previous periods. To be candid with you all, there definitely has been some challenges with the new system. For example, there's not as much transparency as there was in the past with how these rates are calculated. So, there's still a lot of work ahead, and better disclosing to households how their rates are being calculated, but certainly is a good start. So our action items here as it relates to financial preparedness are as follows. First and foremost, check to see what is and what isn't covered by your homeowners or renters insurance, and make sure you really understand that coverage. And along with that, make any necessary changes to ensure that your coverage is sufficient. Save money so you can meet your deductibles, set aside emergency cash if possible, and make a home inventory. Again, I just want to make a note here that I know this is easier said than done. Again, especially with inflation, it's hard to even go to the grocery store without spending more than you're planning to. So I do want to drive home the point that I'm not saying this lightly. One potential suggestion perhaps is to automatically transfer money to an emergency savings account every Friday or once a month, whatever works for you. So that way you never see it and you can't touch it. And ultimately, I suggest this because it will provide that sense of peace and stability during recovery. This sacrifice now, it could provide a lot of peace of mind later, knowing that there are these measures that are in place But again, I know in this financial climate, it's not easy to save money. So certainly recognize that there is a trade-off there. However, if you do check out this checklist after our presentation, go through this exercise, you will be financially protected during the next storm event. So a note here about lenders and flood insurance claims, something that can be confusing for those who have a mortgage. We'll see that households, they may have to wait a certain period of time to receive that insurance payout post storm event. And that's because their mortgage lenders are holding on to it. So important to understand that once the cost of damage from an event reaches a certain price or a certain level, a lot of insurance companies, they're actually legally required to put the check in the mortgage company's name. Some companies might not release the money to the household all at once from a claim check, but rather they'll do it in installments. And in part, this is to provide protection against things like contractor fraud. I encourage you to talk to your loan agent and investigate, really get to understand your insurance company's process. Reach out to consumer protection within state insurance offices if you're having any possible issues with the claim, or if you really just want to get a little bit more information and education. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears once again to our fourth item, our fourth key action in preparedness and in getting ourselves ready for this upcoming hurricane season. Disaster recovery, there's no doubt about it that it is hard, and not having access to the documents that you need to apply for assistance or to file an insurance claim, it makes a difficult process even more so. By taking time and taking care of our important records now, that is one less hurdle that we'll have to deal with in the aftermath of a storm. So here we have listed, and I'll fly through this category pretty quickly here, but we just have a couple buckets, a couple categories of documents that you'll want to think through and organize prior to hurricane season. So that's your personal documents, household documents, financial and legal, and medical documents. So here we have listed some important documents that we at SVP advise you to think about. One thing that you might want to consider doing is helping older people in particular safely gather and upload their documents to a digital service. So something like Google Drive, or scanning and uploading these documents on your computer, something to that effect. And if people aren't comfortable putting their information online, you could always take the route of making copies of important documents and securing them in a place where they can't get flooded. That's of course, the critical piece there, that it would be safe from any flooding. So some examples here are storing them in a file at a friend's house or a bank safe deposit box, maybe if you have an attorney or another trusted colleague, any sort of workspace away from your home if possible. And again, with that theme of a stable, of a reliable recovery, this will give you these measures, safeguarding these documents, it will give you peace of mind in your recovery. So here are just a couple examples of household documents that you should organize and gather in advance of storms. I won't read through this list word for word, but we just have a couple things that you'll want to consider when going through this household documents bucket. Having these types of financial and legal documents available is especially important for speeding up the process of navigating insurance claims or applying for aid. Consider if perhaps your current care provider has any sort of digital records tools that you might find helpful. So things like MyChart or Health Vault or Apple Health, they could be really useful in managing your medical information and getting that safeguarded and online. So as I mentioned before, you can secure your documents physically, so in waterproof folders, containers on flash drives, and you can upload important documents to your cloud or another electronic platform. So this last key item that we're going to talk through today is how we can protect our homes against physical damages. Some of the actions that I'm going to talk through are going to require just a little bit of thinking ahead and maybe a little bit of elbow grease, while some of these are going to be more of an investment. I want you to think about all these different options that we are going to go through today through the lens of what makes the most sense for me and my family. When thinking about ways to mitigate risks to your property and protect your home, it's helpful to think about it in these three categories: inspections and maintenance, securing for emergencies, and property improvements. Inspections and maintenance actions are crucial to prioritize throughout the year to keep your houses in good condition, and so you can identify issues while they're small and therefore less expensive. And really just so that everything can be done in your power to mitigate potential risk to properties before this upcoming hurricane season. I want to draw your attention to the different resource guides that SBP has available on our website and on our Equip app. Things for inspecting your property or inspecting your roof. And again, with this follow-up email, I will make it pretty clear exactly where you need to go to reference these checklists and guides and resources in case you would like to do so. While this webinar that you all are attending today, it focuses on protecting properties from hurricanes and flooding, it's critical to note that some of these actions, especially those that target home protection during these high wind events, are relevant across different storm types. So when you're planning and when you're mapping out different inspection and maintenance actions that make sense for your home, do consider all hazard events that you might be at risk and plan accordingly. We like to throw in a little section on preparing for power outages, and that is because they can happen with most any storm. Make sure that you're prepared year round by doing things like testing your fire alarms and your carbon monoxide monitors. And prepare your household by identifying an alternative power source like a generator. If, however, you are planning on using a generator, learn generator safely. When used correctly, generators are really great backup tools to utilize if you lose power. However, it's important to know those generator safety rules before operating. Some important safety precautions to just run over really quickly are using your generator and fuel outdoors, at least 20 feet away from windows or doors or any sort of attached garages that you might have. Let generators cool completely and keep them dry before refueling. Plug appliances directly into a generator or with a heavy duty extension cord, and make sure that all electrical cords are attached to the generator, or all electrical cords that are attached to the generator are in good condition. And lastly, avoid electrical shock by keeping the cords away from any sort of cold water or ice or snow that might be present. In addition to knowing that those generator safety rules, it's also important that you know your specific energy needs and purchase a generator that best suits those needs. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a couple actions to take pre-disaster. Again, this is specific to hurricanes and flooding. So these are things like laying sandbags near doorways and moving valuable items off of the ground floor. Actions that you take prior to a storm event, such as the ones that we have listed here, they can save money during your recovery. When understanding your risks, so back to the beginning of our presentation earlier, consider what other storm events are likely to occur and any specific quick actions that those will warrant. Here we, excuse me. We have listed some budget-friendly mitigation options that you can take to keep your property safe from hurricanes and flooding. As noted before, mitigation options, they sometimes can be a bit of an investment, but they are the best measures to take to make sure your house is more resilient in the face of future flood events. The long-term mitigation options listed here, while an investment, are very effective means to safeguard your property and lower physical damage to your homes. I know that these, in some cases, might sound alarming and cost prohibitive, but some of these recommendations that I'm making do require limited funds and simply just some time, effort, and planning. So that means it just needs to be a priority. I do want to make a note here that many states have grant programs to help with affordability when it comes to mitigation options. So I encourage you to check out resources like Smart Home America, which has information on mitigation insurance discounts and incentives, tax savings, et cetera, to see what your state specifically has available. And that, of course, is a great segue into the way that mitigation options may positively impact your insurance costs. So think about it like this. Your insurance costs, they are directly tied to your risks. So if you introduce mitigation measures to your property, not only are you safeguarding your house from future storms, but you're also lowering your risk and therefore lowering your liability to insurance companies. So this means that you're reducing your insurance costs. Some examples of these options are raising mechanicals, so heating and cooling systems, water heaters, electrical panels, and other utilities, installing flood openings, filling basements, relocating and elevating your property. And with that last one, property elevation, great to have that elevation certificate to provide. A quick note about elevation certificates. They document the elevation of your building for the floodplain managers who are enforcing local building ordinances and insurance rating purposes. While no longer required for purchasing a federal flood insurance policy, getting your elevation certificate is one of the easiest ways to reduce insurance premium costs. After disasters, SBP rebuilds for low to moderate income homeowners. So place a special focus on families with small children, the elderly, disabled persons, war veterans, and the under and uninsured. SBP prioritizes implementing measures that will help homeowners and survivors mitigate risk and be more resilient in the face of future storm events. One example is through the use of vinyl plank flooring, which we have some pictures on the slide here. This flooring type is resistant to water damage, which makes them easier to maintain. And in most instances of flooding can actually get wet and then dry right out again. Vinyl plank flooring is a very standard material, and it's not any more expensive than laminate, which is another very common flooring type. So to give some dollar figures here, vinyl plank is $2 per square foot, while laminate is $1. So really not too much of a difference there in terms of price. Fortified roofs are another example. These, we use them because years of testing and combined with scientific research have actually really proved that this roofing methodology keeps wind and rain out of homes during high winds, hurricanes, hailstorms, severe thunderstorms, tornadoes, etc. So these high wind events, these roofs really hold up and they stay sturdy. The added cost to do a fortified roof is roughly through that $3,000 for labor and materials based on SBP's experience. But it is important to note that in some states, fortified roofs do qualify for insurance discounts and tax incentives. If you or anyone that you happen to know is making repairs to property in the future, you need to be proactive and protect yourself from potential fraud. And of course, find contractors who can give you quality work at a fair price. SBP has guides that can be used for exactly this, and those can be found directly on our website. We also have a really wonderful short interactive learning module on contractor fraud and also on federal assistance and more. And we encourage you to check those out. Remember too, to always check with the local building department on licensing and permitting requirements before engaging in any type of project. So take action by educating yourself on your risks, purchasing flood insurance, taking actions to mitigate risks to property, and protecting your important documents. And lastly, making that plan. Disaster preparedness and community resilience can only be built through actions taken at the personal, community, local, state, and federal levels. By working together with your families and with your community to get educated and to be prepared, you're doing your part in building a safer and better community that will be able to come together and persevere during this upcoming hurricane season. Lastly, here is that QR code that I had referenced in the beginning of our presentation that will take you to the Equip app. If interested, please do feel free to pull out your phones and your camera app and check out the Equip app through there. Again, this does house our a whole bunch of our resources, videos, checklists, e-learnings on preparedness and recovery topics. Through SAP's Prepare program, we'll also be building out some new resources, and those will be released through these platforms in the coming months. So here is our survey. Once again, it will get thrown in the chat pretty soon. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to fill that out, it should take just about 5 minutes, and we really do appreciate any feedback that we can get. Well, thank you all so much. I realize that we are just past 2 o'clock. I really appreciate everyone's time listening in and bearing with me with those technical difficulties that we had when starting off. Again, seeing that we are at 2 o'clock, I see there's one question in the chat. Please feel free to throw any others on. I will stay on for as long as folks want to throw questions in the chat and continue our conversation. But if anything does pop up, or if you do have to hop off, given the time, I will be following up again with some of those resources I mentioned throughout the presentation and with the recording and the survey. So you will have my contact information and you can reach out with any questions that develop. And with that, I'll go ahead and answer this one question, and then we can wrap up for the day. Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So what I would, well, let me read the question out loud so everyone can hear. Is there a way to see if a property has received funding from a disaster before? So yeah, again, really, really great question. And that goes back to the beginning of our conversation about it not being something that is mandatory in most states for home sellers to disclose to potential homeowners. So here is what I would do if in that situation. First and foremost, when having these conversations with your real estate agent and with the home seller, I would not be shy about the fact that, you are armed with this information. You know that it's not something that needs to be disclosed, but for your safety, for your preparedness, for your sake, if they are aware of anything, to include that in the conversation. Because again, to highlight the fact that, when trying to obtain federal aid, if a house has received disaster aid, doesn't matter if you were the occupant, if that house had received it, and then say that they left within a year or so, you came in, they did not get flood insurance, then, the house is no longer eligible. So I would start off right off the bat, start these conversations. And also, if I were you, I would check out risk factor. And that tool beforehand, just to see, if you're sitting in a floodplain. Of course, if that house is not in a floodplain, that does not mean it's not going to flood, because those are unreliable government maps. But you could start off with, hey, I see that we are not in a floodplain. I looked on risk factor and I see that, there's X amount of risk associated with this property. Before going through with this purchase, if that's of interest to you, just make that a stipulation. I need to understand, has this house flooded in the past? Has this house received funding? And if so, is there flood insurance associated with this house? So certainly starting that conversation with there. And if you are currently in that situation, or if you will be in the future, I would make sure to bring that up to your real estate agent right off the bat and make sure that you're all aware of this concern that you have. All right. Any other questions that we may have? Okay. Given that I'm not hearing anything, I will go ahead and wrap up. And I, again, appreciate everyone's patience. I see that we're just about 5 minutes past. So thank you all for staying on. I really appreciate it. And I will follow up with those resources. Please do feel free to reach out at this, this contact information here. And I am more than happy to continue this conversation, however that might be next. Thank you all again and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.